All right, finishing up chapter 1 of Origins of the American Indian by Lee Huddleston. Starting on page 40, it says, the Friars of Mexico, working as they did with the Aztec legends of vast migrations, came more readily to the Lost Tribes theories than those working in other areas. The legendary wanderings of the Aztecs found a responsive chord in the Christians steeped in the traditions of the Jewish Exodus. By the last quarter of the 16th century, the work of such men as Montolina, Shogun, Duran, Tovar, and Suarez de Peralta had made the Aztecs' oral history available. It was not until the Aztecs' own views about their history became widely known that the obvious, though superficial, parallels with the Jewish traditions could be made. Furthermore, it was not until these comparisons had been made that the writers began to make extensive use of biblical and related traditions to explain and support their theories. Most writers on Indian origins before 1580 did not use the Bible in constructing their theories. Many relied exclusively on non-biblical literary sources. Most went no further into scripture than to insist that all men descended from Adam through Noah. It will be noted that the basis for the Lost Tribes theory lies primarily in the Apocrypha, not the Bible. The Apocrypha were widely known to the educated classes of Europe through the numerous commentaries on the Bible. It is uncertain how much of this knowledge filtered down to the commoners. Once begun, the practice of basing origin theories in Scripture mushroomed, but at no time was this method used to the exclusion of others. Biblical exegesis was useless. Biblical exegesis was useless without information about the Indians, usable for comparative purposes. Nor did biblical exegesis ever dominate the search for known quantities with which to compare the Indians. At any given time, there were probably more men working from non-scriptural sources for their comparative material. Just as those more familiar with New Spain than Peru tended to accept some form of the lost tribe theory, those who were more familiar with Peru tended toward the Opherian theory. Some confusion over what the Opherian theory is has resulted from the fact that those who first mentioned the story did not make clear what they meant. Did they mean to say that the Indians descended from the people who went to Ophir in the time of Solomon? In that case, the Indians would be Jews. Some writers have taken this as the meaning without realizing that there was an alternative. It seems most likely that the writers who referred to Ophir meant to show in the time of Solomon that the land of Ophir was already settled and named. The settlement came long before Solomon, and it was a non-Jewish people who settled it. The passages relating to Ophir are 1 Kings 9:26 through 28 and 10:11, and 2 Chronicles 8:18 and 9:10. King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion Geber, which was near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom, and Hiram sent with the fleet of his servants seamen who were familiar with the sea. Together with the servants of Solomon, they went to Ophir and brought from there gold to the amount of 420 talents, and they brought it to King Solomon. Moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a great amount of among wood and precious stones. This story is repeated almost verbatim in 2 Chronicles 8:18 and 9:10. The only difference being that among wood is algum wood in the Chronicles version. Most writers of the period included 2 Chronicles 9:21. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish used to come back bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks as part of their Ophir story, although they understood that the voyage lasted 3 years. The first clear statement of the Opherian theory, which traced the Indians to the great-great-great-grandson of Noah, named Ophir, appeared about 1572 in the Opertus Criticus, written for the famous Polyglot Bible of Antwerp by the editor Benito Adrias Montano, chaplain to Philip II. The comments of the Opherian origin of the Indians occur in the portion of the apparatus dealing with Genesis 10 and 25. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Adrias Montano called this section Feleg sive de gentium sedibus primus orbisque tarare situo. And as a consequence, writers who knew his arguments referred to his Feleg. One of the men who read Andreas Montano's Feleg had already worked out a similar thesis independently. Miguel Cabello Balboa completed his Miscellanea Antarctica around 1582. After reading Feleg and discovering that its author agreed with him, he arranged his Miscellanea for publication. He completed the reorganization of his materials about 1586 and was not able to publish it. A French translation of a small part of the manuscript appeared in 1840, and a copy of the manuscript was published at Quito in 1945 and in Lima in 1951, with notes on the original. So far as this writer was able to determine, the Miscellanea was the first book devoted primarily to the question of the origins of the American Indians. Lomanus devoted only a dozen pages to the question, but Garcia's Origen was the first published book exclusively on the subject. Cabello Balboa set a very difficult task for himself. Indeed, it was an impossible one. He planned to trace the origin of these American nations from the beginning of the world. This necessitated discovery when the first settlers came to America, how they got there, from which part of the old world they departed for the new world, and by which genealogy they were connected to recognized biblical lines. Actually, he proposed to write what must amount to a little less than a history of human migrations. His sources of information consisted of the Bible, commentators on the Bible, related texts such as the Apocrypha, ancient authors, modern commentaries on America, and his own experience as a missionary in South America. His method was exegetical and comparative. The author solved his greatest problem by deciding on the basis of the similarities of the names Peru and Ophir that the Indians descended from Ophir. Another proof lay in the similarities of the name Yucatan y Yactan and the name of Ophir's father. Cabello Balboa now knew where to start his search for the way the Indians got to America. He had first to determine when Ophir and Yoctan or their descendants left Mesopotamia. That provided easy given the diversity of the languages in America. They must have left after Babel, after the confusion of the tongues. Ophir moved to the Far East, where he became the ancestor of the seafaring peoples of that area. From their descendants of Ophir went to America, where they settled in Peru and New Spain. Cabello Balboa again supported his connection by pointing up the derivation of Peru from Ophir. Peru having been named in honor of their racial ancestor of the natives. In addition, he said the story of the voyage to Ophir in Solomon's day utilized the word Parabim, meaning the two Perus. The second Peru was Yucatan, named in honor of Ophir's father. To those who argued that the word Peru was not connected to that country when the Spanish arrived, Cabello Balboa responded that was true. The natives had forgotten the name. However, it was preserved in the names of the geographical features where the Spaniards found it and received it. Cabello Balboa did not rely wholly on biblical allusions He spent several pages comparing the Indians of America to those of the East Indies. He argued that both used cotton for clothing and their clothing styles were similar. Furthermore, both sat on the ground rather than using chairs or benches, and neither used tables. But what of the difference in the skin color of the Indians and their progenitors? The skin color, he said, changed because of the influence of the sky and force of the stars and the aridity of the winds, which over a long period of time turned the whiteness of their faces into a more or less black color. From time to time, Cabello Balboa interrupted his elaboration of his own story to take issue with a rival theory. He disagreed with Alejo Bangas and the Carthaginian theory because of his opinion. Ano went to the Canaries and thence to the Red Sea. He did not go to the Indies. Cabello Balboa argued that Carthaginian cultural traits, religion, and writing were absent from the New World. Therefore, the Carthaginians surely had not come to America. The Indians did not descend from the Hebrews either. Cabello declared he referred to a lecture by one Juan de El Caño at Salamanca in 1580, which traced the Indians to a Jewish ancestry on the basis of word comparisons. Cabello thought language comparison improper and useless tool in tracing origins. There were too many languages in America for such a method to prove valid. He maintained that in some places, the man and woman of the same family spoke different languages, and it was dishonest for a woman to speak a man's language, and shameful for a man to speak a woman's. Anyway, he concluded the Jews had an alphabet, the Indians did not. To take a specific example, he continued, consider the Quechua language. It indeed had some words similar to Hebrew, but it also had some words similar to French or Spanish, although they had different meanings. Mayo in Spanish referred to the 5th month of the year. In Quiche, it meant river. Macho in Spanish applied to the rival sex, but in Quiche, it meant old. Therefore, Cabello Balboa rejected the Judaic origin as untengible. Cabello Balboa was not entirely correct in his refutation of Bangas. Florian de Ocampo used the Hana story. Bangas did not. He relied on Aristotle's Carthaginian story, which was independent of the Hano tradition. The Miscellanea appears to be a little more than a collection of several papers Cabello Balboa prepared at different times on the subject of Ophir in the Indies. His reorganization for publication was not wholly successful. The book is filled with long digressions and virtually incomprehensible exegetical ramblings. The arguments are generally consistent, but continuity was frequently lost. Since both Las Casas and Cabello Balboa derived the Indians from the East Indies, why did they differ so much? Las Casas, though he did purpose an East Indian origin in his Apologetica Historia, never firmly committed himself to any origin theory. He specifically denied that Solomon visited the New World. That point, however, was incidental to Cabello Balboa's argument. Las Casas and those who later postulated an East Indian origin differed from the Ophirites in a very basic fashion. True, both groups brought the Indians from the same place, but those who held the Opherian theory were not content to settle for the geographical liberation. They had to trace the East Indians to their origins. The Opherian and the Lost Tribes origin theories differed from most other theories in that they traced the Americans to their ultimate origin by connecting them with the biblical genealogies. The analysis of these unpublished but not unused works of the 1580s illustrates the growing complexities and the subtleties of the controversy over the origins of the American Indians, from the simple propositions of Oviedo in 1535 and the relatively uncomplicated solutions of the mid-century of the debate, developed into the largely theological exegesis of Suarez de Peralta and Duran, and occultism of Cabello Balboa. El primer Nuevo Crónica y Buen Gobierno by Felipe Gauman, Palma de Ayala, written between 1587 and 1613 and published for the first time in 1936. It was an even more exoteric production. Palma de Ayala was of pure Indian blood, and his language was only virtually or vaguely Spanish. And his language is only vaguely Spanish. His orthography is generally unidentifiable, but the syntax and style lent his writing a large measure of obscurity. The most recent edition contains the original text and an uninterpretation for modern Spanish readers, which amounts to a translation. His modern translation is frequently inaccurate. For example, Palma de Ayala wrote, "Se escribe que será desde la fundación del mundo 2,000,000 y I don't know what that is. 612 años desde el comienzo hasta el acabo." I think that's supposed to say 60, but I'm not sure. It's old. Which clearly means that, oh, here it is right here. It's 60. It clearly means that 2,612 years will pass between the beginning and the end of the world. Yet the translator renders it desde la creación del mundo hasta la actualidad, han transcrito 2,612 años. Sometimes the translators insert entire passages not in the original. Palma de Ayala writes that Desta, I think it's supposed to be esta, or maybe de esta. Anyway, desta generación comenzaron a multiplicar y la descendencia y multiplicó. Después a estos les llamaron dioses y lo titularon así. And the translation reads, los hombres de esta generación comenzaron a aumentar rápidamente, llegando a ser muy numerosos. Sus descendientes guardado siempre bendición en sus ancestros, o a sus ancestros, a los que llamaron sus dioses, y honorados como tales por más de 6,613 años, y de los cuales de puede descontar para mejor actuar o actitud, actitud, los 800 años que corresponden a la época en que se enseñaron y abrigaron en este reino. I don't like reading Spanish, and Latin even less. Apparently, those who hold to the belief that all civilization began in America are using Palma de Ayala for their own purposes. The chief connection of that school requires considerable antiquity for man in America. The late author Ponsesky, the longtime reader of this group, edited Palma's book in 1944, and the interpreter of the last edition, Luis Bustos Galvez, incorporated many of Ponsesky's notes to the text. The result generally is to indicate that a great antiquity needed by the Polensky school. Bustos Galvez also makes Palma say that the first white men in the world were in Peru. It is easy to do such things to Palma's text. The syntax is too obscure that meaning cannot always be derived. Therefore, Palma does not appear to accept a greater antiquity for man in the New World than most other commentators of his day. Palma wrote of one of Noah's sons coming God brought to the Indies, and he attributed orderly, civilized life to the Incas around the time of David. It seems as if he thought men came to America shortly after the flood and developed independently there. The bulk of his book concerned what was happening in America at the time of the important events in the Old World. Juan de Castellanos, in his Alegrías de Varones Ilustres de las Indias of 1589, wrote of the reaction of Columbus's men when they first encountered the Indians. Si son citrios estos o silvianos, y ellas aquellas ninfias de Aristotle, y son fonos labiosos y lozanos and las, you know what, I'm not reading that. Spanish is too hard to read. These thoughts placed in the minds of the first Europeans to see the Indians tell much more about the poet's own time than about 1942. Columbus's men thought that they were in Asia and would have no reason to wonder about the humanity of the men they found there. But in Castellanos' own time, the ferment over the origin and nature of the Indians was so great that it was even being read into the past where it did not belong. It is indicative of the confusion over the questions concerning the Indians that although Castellanos put many questions into the minds of his characters, the only answer he gave was that the Indians were, after all, sons of Adam. That alone was certain, and that alone is certain.